Across from the Golden Gate, at the eastern foot of the San Francisco Bay Bridge, lies the small city of Emeryville, California. It is a crossroads. Travelers from the four directions arrive at its doorstep at the intersection known as the Maze. Emeryville has capitalized on its location.
This location is a fabulous retail site. It has great freeway visibility. Some 250,000 cars a day travel by on the I-80 freeway, and they travel at usually quite slow speeds, so they have quite a bit of time to see what's going on here.
Bay Street was born in 2002. 400,000 square feet of retail, restaurants, and a 16-screen movie theater. Apartments and townhouses are coming soon. Even before construction began, both the city and the developer knew they were sitting on a gold mine. What they didn't realize is there would be a hidden cost waiting for them underground. But first, they had to deal with the toxic residue that covered the site.
As a matter of fact, I can show you a photo of that. If you look at the photo, an overhead photo of the city of Emeryville, you will find an orange blob right in the middle of Emeryville. And it stems from the pigment plant that had 100,000-gallon vats of acid, making an orange pigment for paint. The ground was bubbling with acid, and it had white streaks through it from where the arsenic was. And you could see out in the bay every time it rained that this pollution was flowing quite readily into the bay. It was a fairly horrendous situation, and no one who was a developer would want to build alongside that. So it was definitely a stigmata there that created an issue that needed to be addressed.
It wasn't uncommon to have contamination properties, but to have these types of chemicals, not only the number of them, but I think the types, as I'm not an environmental engineer, but I understand the composition of the area where you have a combination of lead with arsenic. So there was combinations of chemicals that we hadn't seen in other properties in Emeryville.
Inspectors found over 50 different chemicals on site, in mixtures they called cocktails.
And I don't remember the exact timing, but I remember it had to do with some ponding, and shells were then seen. That was, I think, the kind of first indicator that there was, some remnants of the past.
When Emeryville first contacted me, they were so cryptic, just saying they had an archaeological problem. I didn't know what to expect. But as we were just walking across the site, really just trying to get a sense of the lay of the land, and also there were areas of the site that the project engineer had told us we could not go on under any circumstances. So we were just sort of walking around trying to delineate those parts of the site that we could walk on, those parts of the site that we couldn't. And one of my people said, "Look at this." And we looked down and there was a burial. And then there was another one 5 feet away, and another, and another. And what we saw originally was part of the skull was exposed. So as we started just brushing the dirt off, the whole skeleton became visible.
I got this overwhelming compulsion, even though I knew that the ground was toxic and that anything you touched there could contaminate you. I couldn't help but bend over and pick up some bone frags. It was a jaw, actually, what it was. I picked it up and I kind of dug a little hole and I put them down and I covered it up and I said, "Forgive me."
There was a lot of human bone just strewn all over the site. So it was a matter of, scraping along with a backhoe and just picking up the bits, the scattered bits of human bone.
And he put the backhoe bucket in and immediately exposed several skeletons. They were buried so closely together, one on top of the other and next to each other and everything. But they were so saturated with this stuff. None of us wanted to go in and touch it, even, with gloves on. Well, there were lots of different kinds of ooze. There was a particular kind of ooze that was, it made the bones rubbery. So that this was probably the worst that I saw. It made the bones a rubbery texture, and when you would pick up the bone, this sort of orange and black oozy goo would kind of run out of it.
There was one burial in the site that really made us ponder. That was two adults buried together side by side and intermingled. Their limbs were intermingled. We found burials of adult women with fetuses or with infants. We found some clusters of burials that almost certainly were buried together or very, very close to the same time. It makes you wonder about the story.
The first people to live along the shore of the San Francisco Bay moved in over 5,000 years ago. They found a marshland dense with salmon, otters, seals, and whales. The sea and the sky were filled with millions of migratory birds. The lush environment, good food and weather attracted people from all over. It became one of the most densely populated areas of native North America. The mix of cultures and languages created a diversity unparalleled on the planet. Though they were skilled at hunting deer, elk, and grizzly bears, they survived on a steady diet of shellfish. Large mounds of shells were created from the discarded remnants of their meals, piling up over the centuries. This chunk of the Emeryville shell mound represents 3,000 years of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Shell by shell, the mound grew 3 stories high and would have covered an entire city block.
It was a huge site, and it was literally like a library in an archaeological sense. It was a repository of the knowledge left by generation after generation of prehistoric peoples living in the Bay Area.
The development of these shell mounds ends up being first housing where people lived, then garbage, because wherever people live, we create garbage, and then they became mortuary complexes.
Oftentimes in the very core of the mound itself, the early basal deposits, oftentimes there's a cemetery. And what I mean by this is that it appears to be a laid out situation where a group of people were buried intentionally.
So my ancestors buried their family, probably in the backyard, put stones on it so they could protect it from the wildlife. And then later on, you could bury your dead. Now what happens is they're throwing the refuse that direction. Over 100, 200 years, where they're living with the burials in the backyard is lower than the mound that's over here. So the next generation or 2 or 3 generations move over here and they start throwing the shells where the memory is lost of where the burials were.
Shellmound Park was a kind of amusement that we don't really have today. People who went to Shellmound Park, say for a picnic on a Saturday or a Sunday, this would be a full day's excursion. So they would ride the ferry over to the Oakland Long Wharf, get off the ferry, board a train, ride the train as far as the Shellmound station.
In 1924, Shellmound Park was captured on film in the silent classic Greed. It had been the Bay Area's leading amusement park for half a century, featuring a shooting range, racetrack, and carousel. But the park's defining feature was the dance pavilion on top of the 30-foot mound.
If there was ever a graphic example of dancing on people's graves, this was it. People were literally doing the Irish jig, polkas, all kinds of dancing in this dance pavilion on top of the Shellmound. And there were formal burials, many, probably more than hundreds, probably thousands. And yet at the same time, it's like the other side of the coin. It's only because that dance pavilion was built on top of that mound that that mound survived until science caught up with it with the establishment of the Department of Anthropology at UC Berkeley in about 1900, 1901.
Archaeologists cut shafts into the mound and uncovered dozens of burials. Some were several hundred years old, others several thousand. They discovered that the mound continued underground, even below the waterline.
I think it was, the likelihood is very high that any of the large shell mounds, whatever you see on the surface is probably just a tip of the iceberg of what's down below.
Archaeologists watched as the mound was leveled in 1924. Sifting through the debris, they managed to piece together skeletons of 651 people. The Sherwin-Williams paint factory was built on top a few years later. The plant specialized in using ochre to produce a red paint.
When you see a burial in the ground, that represents a person, and you really feel like you're touching the past. You know that represents somebody who cared about somebody.
Somebody's relative, somebody who, who knows who these people were, or what status they had in the community. Their families were probably torn apart that they lost their relative, and had a gathering, put them in the ground, paid their respects, had a ceremony. And here somebody comes along, rips their relative out of the ground.
It's obvious that the rest of the body was removed by the equipment because it's such a clean cut, and also as you remove what's left, you see that there's nothing tucked underneath. It's disappointing. It almost looks kind of like a violent thing.
Inside, I was feeling this emotion of wanting to scream, wanting to cry at the same time, and every time I think about it, so it's a place I don't want to ever set foot on again. Not because my people are there, but because of what has transpired.
Would you want a bunch of Indians coming around digging up your ancestors? How would you feel if we went and dug up your grandma's grave? And, it's, people need to be asked those hard questions, and, not in a way that they can choose to answer or not, but really put it to them.
How did you feel knowing that when the construction crew was going in there, they were encountering not only toxic waste, but human remains? How did that make you feel?
How do I answer that? I'm struggling with that one. Regarding your question, how it affect me personally. And I was out here at the site very frequently, observing what was going on in the area of high sensitivity, which we designated that we had to undertake special construction practices. And I'm actually pretty proud with how we as a company dealt with this. And I'm not sure every firm out there would have acted in such a responsible manner. The steps that we took to avoid disturbance of the human remains, of the cultural resources, the respect that our company and the construction workers out here gave to the Native Americans on site who encountered any remains when that occurred. I don't know how many. I was really proud of the team that we had together and how that was handled. So, am I bothered? Is my conscience tormented by that? No, quite the opposite.
The Emeryville Shellmound now, commercial, trading. What do the Indians do there? They also traded, and the housing up on top. Nothing's different. History repeats itself. It's just a new people living there, and they're doing nothing different than what my ancestors did when they lived there, on top of where the burials are, because there's still burials down there. And because look at the location. The real estate people tell us location, location, location. You're right there crossing the bay. The winds bring people in. Don't you think that was the trade market 2,000 years ago, where people from the north brought things down and people from the south brought it over? East and west came in. It probably was the flea market of the Ohlone world right there.
Burials were found all over the property. These red stars represent clusters of up to 32 bodies. The stores on Bay Street were built on 80-foot pilings that act as stilts above the bay mud. This design meant that as few graves were disturbed as possible. Still, 300 bodies were uncovered during construction. Archaeologists estimate that hundreds more remain underground. Those that were disturbed were reburied in an unmarked mass grave on site. A memorial was installed to acknowledge the Shellmound, but it doesn't allude to any burials at all.
Oh yes, that's very deliberate. I mean, if I had my way, I'd chisel that on the sign too, that where you stand, there were, over the last 100 years, probably 1,000 or more people have been excavated and relocated. And this was their burial site, but due to modern life. But you can't put that on the wall because people just can't stomach it. Some Indian people don't want people to know that. Maybe the shopper doesn't want to know that, okay? Maybe the business people that own the property going, this is so controversial, we don't need to put that there. What I would have said is, over here where we're going to do the reburial, I want a monument. And I wanted to read the tombs of the unknown Ohlones. And let's put a marker and say, right here, they're buried. I have no shame of that. And then every day, Madison Marquette will be required to place fresh flowers there. What's wrong with that?
This is a cemetery, okay? Just like any other cemetery. And when you walk onto that side, had you had an opportunity before it was developed, you would have known it. You would have felt it. You would have seen it. You would have had the same feelings I did.
Some people feel it. Some people don't. I think I feel it. I feel very uncomfortable when I get near it. Even though I don't think I did a bad thing being out there. I served as a witness.
I've shopped there. I did my Christmas shopping there this season because they have all the stores I like there. Apparently, I don't feel like I'm going to get struck down by lightning if I walk out there.
All along the bay, where you see any activity, it is highly likely that there have been Native Americans living there, and that with the shell mounds, there are some burial of Native American Indians. So you're walking along them or on top of them as it is now.
I think it's a very toxic place. I can't imagine wanting to spend too much time there. I can just keep remembering the smells and the sights, and it's not a place to live. It's a burial ground, a contaminated one.
The Emeryville Mound was was the largest of over 400 mounds that once ringed the bay. Today, none remain intact.